Why did he laugh at her uniform? That question hung in the silence of the maintenance bay long after Director Edmund Hayes' voice had cut across the concrete walls. The polished administrator in his spotless civilian suit had pointed at the faded cloth stitched above Ree Palmer's chest pocket as if it were an offense to the very order of things. His laughter wasn't the kind of nervous chuckle people use to cover uncertainty. It was sharp, mocking, intentional. Every mechanic, technician, and electrician under her supervision froze in place. Their gazes shifted, not at Hayes, not at his assistant with the tablet, but at Ree. At her, the patch. The emblem that had survived saltwater, heat, dust, and years of laundering. The one she never spoke about. The one that, truth be told, she sometimes wished she'd left in a drawer. Unauthorized decoration, Hayes said, his voice dripping with disdain. Probably something from a surplus store. Her mouth was dry, but her tone stayed even. Sir, with respect, that patch was earned. It represents service most don't know exists. And for a moment she thought he might stop. But instead his words grew louder, crueler, feeding on the silence of the bay like fire feeds on oxygen. He questioned her integrity, her right to wear a uniform, her past. He turned her crew, her family, into an audience for humiliation. Inside her chest, she felt something colder than anger. She had faced combat fire. She had crawled through wreckage with blood on her hands, steady because others depended on her steadiness. But this, being stripped down by a man who had never been in the dirt with anyone, who thought authority came from polished shoes and sharpened pens, this was its own battlefield. And just when his words rose to their peak, footsteps cut the air. A voice, calm, commanding, a single question: what's going on here? The kind of question that froze time. All eyes turned. A Navy commander filled the doorway, his dress blues crisp, his presence unmistakable. Knox Mills. His gaze swept the room, settled on her. Then it fell on the patch. His expression changed, subtle but unmistakable, recognition. And something else. Reverence. The laughter, the mockery, the accusations, all of it died in the air. But before her story could continue, before the truth of that patch could be spoken aloud, Ree's mind was already pulling her backward. Years back, to the day she first stood in a formation under a blistering Carolina sun, to when she was just another young sailor, trying to prove herself in a Navy that still measured women by doubts before they measured them by deeds. And what had begun as a simple inspection in a maintenance bay suddenly cracked open a vault of memories. Memories stitched into that patch. Memories of a life she had never explained to anyone here. Because the patch didn't come from a store. It came from blood. From nights when the ocean carried more secrets than any one person should be allowed to hold. From missions where she had been told, succeed or people will never know you tried. She remembered the heat of Camp Lejeune, the voice of Senior Chief Amanda Stone barking her name like an order and a dare. Palmer, front and center. Her boots had hit the pavement harder than her heart. Stone, a legend in the engineering world, had circled her like a hawk circling prey. You think you're ready for fleet assignment? Yes, Senior Chief. Stone's eyes narrowed. Your scores say more than fleet. You've mastered systems, solved problems that stumped sailors with a decade of service. You don't just fix things, you think. So let me ask you, Palmer, what do you know about naval special warfare support? The air had grown heavier. Ree had only heard whispers, special units, shadow missions, no names on records, no second chances. Very little, Senior Chief. Good, Stone said. That means you're not chasing a fantasy, but they're looking for people like you. Think on your feet. Survive the impossible. Keep systems alive when the whole world wants them dead. It's voluntary, harder than anything you've seen. Some don't make it through. Some never come back. Ree had stood still, heart pounding in her throat, and realized this wasn't about a career. It was about discovering what she was truly capable of. And 3 weeks later, she found herself standing shoulder to shoulder with candidates who looked carved from granite. 20 men for every woman. Most had seen combat. Most wore scars like proof of survival. She wore determination like armor. Lieutenant Commander Walsh had towered before them, ribbons across his chest whispering of lands and seas she couldn't imagine. For the next 12 weeks, he said, you'll learn things about yourselves you didn't know were there. Some of you will break. Some of you will discover strength you didn't think you had. This isn't about medals. It isn't about glory. It's about functioning under impossible conditions. Because in special warfare support, failure doesn't mean poor evaluations. Failure means death. Sometimes yours, sometimes your team. She hadn't known then that those words would echo inside her for the rest of her life. The first week nearly destroyed her. Push-ups in mud until her arms gave out. Cold water drills until her teeth cracked from clenching. Navigation exercises that left her gasping in darkness, lungs burning. People dropped, one after another. David Johnson, a former football player built like a wall, gone after 3 days of underwater navigation. Maria Santos, brilliant with systems, eliminated after failing night-land courses. Ree stayed, not because she was the strongest, not because she was the smartest, but because every time she wanted to quit, a voice inside whispered, just one more step, one more try, one more second. Coach Turner had pulled her aside after the 4th week. Palmer, you're different. You don't muscle through, you think. You figure out rope climbs with leverage, not brute force. That's what keeps people alive. Remember that. She had carried his words like ammunition. Medical drills came next. Dr. Sandra Bell showed them how to stop bleeding with a pen and tubing, how to cut airways open with a knife when seconds meant survival, how to improvise surgery on the floor of a tent. The first time she held a scalpel, her hands shook, not from fear of blood, but from fear of failure. But when a classmate pretended to go into shock and she was the only one who kept steady pressure, she realized she had something worth more than muscle: calm. Then came weapon systems. Chief Anderson had laid out tools of war most sailors would never see. Rifles built to survive saltwater, comms designed to whisper through hundreds of feet of ocean, devices that looked like they came from the future. These aren't toys, Anderson had said. They're lifelines. They keep people breathing when the world's against them. And Ree had picked one up, felt its weight, and for the first time thought, I belong here. Weeks blurred into exhaustion, into failure followed by breakthroughs, into nights where she stared at a ceiling, body screaming, mind whispering, you made it one more day. And when only 12 of the original 47 remained, Master Chief Reed appeared. His voice gravel, his presence undeniable. You think you're special, he told them. You're not. You're minimum standard. The real test begins now. Inside that building, you'll train for missions that don't exist on paper. Fail here and you don't just wash out, you disappear. Succeed and you join the few who stand between chaos and survival. Ree had seen her reflection in the glass doors then, and she almost didn't recognize the woman looking back. Not the sailor who joined to escape small-town nothingness. Not the technician who thought success meant clean uniforms and evaluations. Someone else. Someone remade. And as she crossed the threshold into that building, her story had begun in truth. The story that Patch carried. The very one Director Hayes had mocked. What he didn't know, what none of her crew knew, was that the piece of fabric on her chest was rarer than all the medals on his shelf. It was a symbol not of what she wore, but of what she'd survived. And now in this maintenance bay, as Commander Mills' gaze lingered on that patch, she knew something was coming. Something that would finally, inevitably, pull the truth into the light. How many secrets can a single piece of cloth hold? That question pressed on Ree Palmer's chest as heavily as the faded patch itself. Standing in the shadow of Commander Knox Mills' presence, she felt the years unwind like an old film reel, pulling her deeper into the past she had locked away. The classified facility she had entered with Master Chief Reed, and the 11 other survivors of selection training was unlike anything she had known. No flags, no names on plaques, no reminders of rank or ceremony. Just work, just preparation for missions that officially didn't exist. Inside those walls, she had been told, the ordinary rules no longer applied. Here, the Navy operated in the shadows. Here, technology blurred the line between science fiction and survival. And here, mistakes were measured not in demerits but in lives. "Everything you see from this point forward," Reed said, his voice echoing through the steel corridors, "is classified above your clearance. Understand this: if you fail, there won't be paperwork, there won't be excuses, and there won't be recognition. The patch you earn here is not for display. It is for survival. It means you are trusted with knowledge too dangerous to leave in unsteady hands." Ree had nodded with the others, but inside her, a quiet storm brewed. She thought of her mother back home, who believed Ree was just another sailor turning wrenches on ships. She thought of Jake, her friend before she joined, who had once asked why anyone would trade freedom for orders. How could she explain this place to them if she wasn't even allowed to say it existed? The answer, of course, was simple: she couldn't. That was the first cost: silence. Their training shifted into realms beyond exhaustion. One week, she was chest-deep in freezing salt water, trying to restore a sabotaged generator while smoke grenades filled the air above. Another, she was hunched over a laptop-sized device that seemed to hum with impossible energy, learning to reroute communications through encrypted tunnels that even satellites couldn't track. "Your job isn't to fight," Lieutenant Commander Jack Harrison had told them during one of those nights when exhaustion blurred into clarity. "Your job is to keep us fighting. That means systems. That means lives. If you can't improvise under pressure, then you're just a liability, and we don't carry liabilities into the field." The words bit deep. Ree carried them into her dreams, into every labored breath on obstacle courses, into every moment she thought she might not belong. Because belonging, that was the real war she fought. She was one of 2 women left in the program. The other, a wiry medic named Lopez, had dropped out after failing to stabilize a simulated casualty under fire. Ree had watched her walk away without a word. The next morning her bunk was empty. Her name was never spoken again. Now Ree was the only woman among 11 men, most of them harder, stronger, more experienced. And though they didn't say it, she felt it, the question always hanging in the air. Could she hold the line? Could she prove her worth when lives were on the edge? Some nights, lying awake, she feared the answer might be no. But fear never left her frozen. It drove her harder. She remembered one night in particular, a simulated boarding exercise in stormy seas. She was tasked with repairing a comms array that had been deliberately fried. Waves slammed the platform, wind tore at her face, salt stung her eyes. Palmer Murphy, one of the operators, shouted over the roar, "3 minutes or we abort." Her fingers bled as she stripped wires, soldered connections with shaking hands, piecing together circuits with nothing but scraps. Each second felt like an hour, and when the radio crackled back to life with a burst of static and then a clear voice, her entire chest felt like it was on fire. Harrison's voice had cut through the storm then. "Outstanding, Palmer. You just saved the mission." It wasn't praise she clung to. It was the relief in his tone, the reminder that even if she felt small, her role mattered. But the tests didn't stop. By the 10th week, only 8 remained. 8 candidates who had sweated, bled, and clawed their way past every wall. And that was when Master Chief Reed told them the truth. "You've met standards," he said, "but standards don't earn this patch. Missions do. Tomorrow, each of you will be assigned to an operational team. You'll deploy, real world, no simulation. You will either prove you belong or you will not return." The room fell silent. Ree felt her pulse hammer in her throat. Tomorrow, not a test, not a drill, a mission. That night she didn't sleep. She stared at the ceiling of her bunk, listening to the quiet breathing of the men around her, and thought of the question Stone had asked her months ago. Do you want to find out what you're really capable of? By dawn, she had her answer. She walked into briefing room 7 with her heart steady and her jaw set. Lieutenant Commander Harrison stood at the front, eyes on a projection screen. "Welcome to Operation Deep Water," he said. "What you're about to hear doesn't exist outside this room." Maps lit up the wall, satellite imagery of a facility carved into desert rock. At first glance, it looked like a simple naval depot, but then the details emerged: patrol routes, surveillance towers, comm arrays hidden beneath camouflage. "This installation," Harrison continued, "isn't just stockpiling. Intelligence confirms it's coordinating hostile operations against shipping lanes in the Persian Gulf. Conventional response is off the table. This requires surgical precision. That's where we come in." The room was still. "You will insert by submarine," Harrison said. "Transit to the coast in disguised civilian craft. Infiltrate the facility. Identify, sabotage, and disable key systems. Extract before dawn." His gaze fell on Ree. "Palmer, you'll be responsible for keeping us connected to our ride home. Comms and navigation are yours. You'll also provide technical improvisation as needed and medical support if necessary. Understand this: if we lose contact, we are stranded. No backup, no cavalry, just us." Her throat tightened, but she nodded. "Understood, sir." And as the briefing continued, a weight settled on her shoulders heavier than any rucksack. He had given her the team's lifeline. Their survival wasn't just about firepower. It was about her. That night, aboard the USS Steadfast, she sat in a cramped technical bay running diagnostics on equipment worth more than her entire hometown. She adjusted settings, logged backup solutions, and prepared for contingencies she couldn't name. Her hands moved with mechanical certainty, but her mind wandered. To her father's silence when she enlisted, to her brother's laughter when she said she'd join the Navy, to every voice that had ever told her, "You won't make it." And here she was, about to deploy on a mission she could never admit existed, wearing a uniform no one would recognize, carrying responsibilities most would never believe. Harrison appeared beside her, leaning against the console. "How's it looking, Palmer?" "Primary systems green," she said, eyes on the displays. "But I've identified 3 weak points. I've prepped backup circuits if they fail." He nodded once, approving. "That's what keeps people alive, the problems you see before they kill you. Good work." And for a fleeting second, the weight on her chest eased. But when he left, the silence closed in again. She stared at the patch in her locker. It wasn't official. It wasn't polished. It wasn't meant to be displayed. It was meant to remind her of this moment, this mission, this responsibility. And as the submarine cut silently through the black waters of the Gulf, Ree lay awake, heart racing. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the mission would change everything. That by dawn, she would no longer be the woman trying to prove herself. By dawn, she would carry a truth heavier than any patch. Why did the ocean feel different when it wasn't training anymore? That thought haunted Ree Palmer as she lowered herself into the Persian Gulf waters under the shrouded night sky. The inflatable boat bobbed silently behind her, abandoned at the insertion point. Ahead lay a hostile coastline that promised nothing but danger. Beneath her, black waves carried currents that tugged and twisted with unseen hands. In training pools, she had learned to trust her equipment. Here, trust was an illusion. Salt water seeped into every seam, threatened every circuit. The rebreather in her mouth muted her breath to silence, but she could feel her pulse echoing louder than any machine. 20 feet beneath the surface, the world changed. Sound muffled, vision clouded, time stretched. Her equipment pack dug into her shoulders like an anchor. Inside it sat the communication relay, her responsibility, their lifeline. If it failed, if she failed, the team would vanish into hostile territory with no way back. Palmer status, Murphy's voice crackled faintly through her bone conduction earpiece. "Steady, on course. Depth 20, she whispered, bubbles curling past her faceplate. The team swam in formation through shifting currents, each stroke calculated, every movement practiced to the point of muscle memory. But no training could replicate the weight of reality. Every shadow beneath her felt alive. Every ripple seemed a threat. She imagined unseen eyes watching, sonar sweeping, radars pinging. Fear whispered of patrol boats overhead, of searchlights breaking the surface. She forced the thoughts down. Focus on the bearings, focus on the relay, focus on breathing. When they finally surfaced near the shore, the beach stretched before them in silence, empty. But silence in hostile territory was never empty. It was waiting. Ree's hands trembled as she buried the relay device in damp sand, camouflaging it beneath a thin layer while ensuring the antenna extended toward open water. The green light blinked faintly, a pulse of connection back to the Steadfast, waiting 40 miles offshore. "Relay active," she whispered. "Copy," came the submarine's voice, calm and distant. The confirmation loosened something in her chest, for now they were not alone. The team assembled quietly on shore, dark shapes moving like shadows. Harrison signaled with his hand, "Advance." No words, no unnecessary sound. Ree adjusted her pack and fell in line. Her boots pressed into foreign soil, sand giving way beneath her weight. 2 miles inland stood their target, the facility intelligence had described as lightly defended, but already her equipment whispered otherwise. The air around her shimmered with invisible signals, frequencies, pulses, encrypted chatter. She tapped the scanner clipped to her chest. 12 distinct surveillance systems lit up on her display. "This isn't light," she murmured. "Multiple active grids, coverage overlap, windows are narrow." Harrison leaned close enough for only her to hear. "Can you get us through?" Ree swallowed hard. "Yes, sir, but timing has to be exact." And so began their crawl through the teeth of the dragon. She tracked patrols on her display, calculated blind spots in shifting surveillance beams. Every step was a gamble. 30 seconds to move through a gap before a sensor swept back. 45 seconds before the next guard's flashlight passed. One mistake, one sound, one misstep, and their mission would end in fire. She counted breaths as they moved, counted heartbeats. At one crossing, her boot slipped on gravel. The sound, small, insignificant, felt deafening in the dark. She froze, breath caught in her throat. A guard turned, light sweeping closer. Her fingers flew across her scanner, activating a burst of countersignal that mimicked static interference. The guard frowned, tapped his radio, muttered into the headset. Then, after a long pause, turned away. Ree's knees went weak with relief, but she didn't let it show. Not here, not now. Minutes stretched into hours. The facility loomed closer, concrete walls lit faintly by distant floodlights. Guard towers pierced the skyline like jagged teeth. And then the first crack in intelligence appeared. Her scanner pulsed red, unknown frequencies, not the weak patterns of outdated civilian security, stronger, faster, adaptive. She tapped her comm. "Sir, these aren't civilian systems. They're military grade. Something's wrong. This facility isn't what they told us." Harrison's jaw tightened in the moonlight. "Understood. Adjust and move." The others glanced at her, the weight of her words sinking in. They weren't sneaking into a depot. They were walking into a fortress. Inside, she could feel her own doubt creeping in. If intelligence was wrong about this, what else were they wrong about? Still they advanced. Still she guided them. At the facility's outer wall, Mitchell, the comm specialist, began bypassing electronic locks. His tools sparked faintly in the dark, fingers moving with practiced precision. But seconds stretched, then minutes, and the lock refused. "These aren't standard systems," he muttered, frustration in his tone. "Encryption's adaptive, like it's learning." Ree crouched beside him, connecting her own device. Data spilled across her display, shifting codes, recursive loops, defense mechanisms countering every attempt. She had never seen anything like it. "This is AI-driven," she whispered. "It's analyzing intrusion attempts in real time and rewriting its defenses." Mitchell swore under his breath. "That's not supposed to exist." But it did. Harrison's eyes cut to options. She hesitated. "I can brute force it, but we'll have to shut down all non-essential systems. We'll be blind. No hostile tracking, no surveillance feeds, just me versus the lock." The silence that followed was heavier than any order. To blind themselves here was to walk willingly into danger. But Harrison didn't flinch. "Do it." Ree's hands flew, rerouting every ounce of power into her intrusion device. Her displays darkened, except for the furious cascade of code battling code. Sweat dripped from her brow, her breath shallow. 30%, 40. The system adapted, throwing new walls. She broke them, it learned, she countered. 60%, 70. Her head pounded, every second stretching into eternity. Finally the lock clicked, a small sound, yet deafening in the silence. "Entry achieved," she whispered. The heavy door slid open. Inside lay shadowed corridors, steel and concrete humming faintly with power. But before they could move, her displays flared back to life, and what they revealed froze her blood. Hostile forces, multiple squads, moving toward their position from 3 angles. Communication chatter spiking across frequencies. "They know we're here," she breathed. And then, cutting through her headset, came a voice that made the world tilt. "American forces," the voice said, accented but commanding. "You are surrounded. Surrender now and you will be treated according to international law." The words chilled her more than the water had. They weren't just detected. Their secure comms had been penetrated. Mitchell's face went pale. "They're inside our systems. If they can hear us, they might know everything. Extraction points, submarine positions, protocols." Ree's chest tightened. This was worse than failure. This was compromise. Harrison's voice was low, steady, but sharp. "Palmer, can you shut them out?" Her hands trembled over the console. The enemy wasn't just guessing frequencies. They were using technology she recognized. Technology that should have been theirs. "I can try," she said, "but it'll take everything. We'll lose visibility, we'll lose time, and if I fail, we'll lose everything." Harrison's eyes locked on hers. "Then don't fail." And in that moment, with hostile boots echoing in approaching corridors, with the weight of 11 lives on her shoulders, Ree realized something terrifying. The mission wasn't about disabling a facility anymore. It wasn't about sabotage or secrecy. It was about survival. And the only thing standing between survival and disaster was her. She closed her eyes for half a second, whispering a truth no one else could hear. "I want it to matter. This is it." Then her fingers began to fly. What does it feel like to fight an enemy you can't even see? That question gripped Ree Palmer as her fingers raced across the console, code unraveling in furious bursts. The hostile signal surged like a tide against her defenses, adapting with terrifying precision. This wasn't just hacking. This was war fought in ones and zeros, every keystroke a bullet, every countermeasure a shield. Behind her, the rest of the team fanned out in the corridor, weapons raised, listening for footsteps they knew were closing in. The air smelled of oil and ozone, heavy with anticipation. "They're cutting us off," Murphy whispered, ear pressed to the wall. "North Hall, east access," and he froze, "roof ingress. 3 angles, no exit." Ree's hands shook as she fought to shut the intruders out of their comms. But the more she worked, the clearer it became. This wasn't just enemy defense. It was something else. Something that shouldn't have existed in this desert facility. "Sir," she breathed, "this system isn't theirs, it's ours. US designed, advanced beyond what we've seen, if they're using it." Harrison's jaw hardened. Then someone gave it to them. The word stung. Treason, betrayal. Technology meant to protect sailors, now weaponized against them. And an engineer, a technician, was staring at the evidence in real time. A crack of gunfire split the silence. Bullets ricocheted off concrete, sparks flying. The first squad had arrived. "Contact," Murphy roared, dropping to one knee as he fired into the advancing shadows. The corridor erupted. Gunfire echoed like thunder, muzzle flashes strobed across steel. The team returned fire in controlled bursts, every shot precise, every movement rehearsed. But Rhee's battlefield wasn't bullets, it was code, and she was losing ground. Her systems screamed warnings as firewalls collapsed, defenses breached. Then, a flash of inspiration. If she couldn't outfight the adaptive AI, maybe she could overload it. She rerouted power, forcing conflicting signals into the system. An electrical storm of data, feeding it contradictions until its adaptive core began to falter. And then silence. The hostile voice vanished, comms cleared. "Channel secure," she gasped. But victory came too late. The enemy was inside. Flashbangs detonated down the corridor. White light seared her vision, sound crushed her ears. She dropped, instinct screaming, heart pounding. When her sight cleared, chaos reigned. Enemies in dark uniforms poured in, moving with precision that spoke of training, not militia improvisation. Murphy went down hard, shoulder torn by a burst of fire. Mitchell dragged him behind cover, returning shots with gritted teeth. "Palmer," Harrison's voice cut through the roar, "we need a way out now." She scanned the corridor, the facility map overlaying her display. No exits. Every route converged on enemy choke points. They were funneled, trapped. Except... Her eyes fell on a maintenance shaft buried in the blueprint. Narrow, cramped, dangerous, but it led beyond the walls. "There," she shouted, pointing. "Shaft C12, west wall. It's tight, but it clears the perimeter." Harrison didn't hesitate. "Move." The team laid down suppressive fire as Rhee sprinted, pack bouncing against her back, lungs burning. She reached the shaft, yanked the panel free, and felt her stomach sink. The opening was barely wider than her shoulders, dark, rusted, reeking of oil. "It's the only shot," she forced out. "Single file, fast." One by one, the team squeezed into the shaft, their gear scraping against steel. Murphy groaned as Mitchell pushed him forward, blood streaking his sleeve. Rhee was last. She shoved herself into the claustrophobic tunnel, metal biting into her arms, darkness swallowing her whole. Every crawl forward echoed in her ears, breath ragged, heart hammering. Behind them, the corridor thundered with gunfire. Enemy boots clanged against steel. And then silence. Not the silence of safety, the silence of pursuit. She crawled faster, scraping knees, ignoring pain. Ahead, faint moonlight filtered through the end of the shaft. Freedom. They spilled out into the desert night, gasping, covered in grease and dust. The facility loomed behind them, floodlights sweeping across walls like searching eyes. But freedom was a lie. Vehicles roared to life in the distance. Engines, headlights cutting through the dark. "They're mobilizing," Lopez hissed, dragging Murphy to his feet. Rhee tapped her comm, praying the relay still held. "Steadfast, this is Palmer. Do you copy?" Static, then faint. "Oppie, signal degraded. You're compromised. Advise immediate extraction." Relief surged, short-lived. Extraction meant the beach, and the beach was crawling with hostiles. Harrison's face was stone. "Options." Rhee swallowed, scanning her gear. The relay couldn't carry through the jamming. Not here, not with enemy tech saturating the air. Unless... "We can boost the signal," she said quickly. "But it requires elevation, a clear line. We need the ridge east of here, 2 miles, exposed terrain." "Do it," Harrison ordered. The march began. They moved through scrub and sand, shadows stretching long in the moonlight. Every crunch of boots sounded like thunder in her ears. Behind them, searchlights swept wider. Gunfire cracked sporadically, distant but closing. Ree's legs burned, lungs raw, but she pressed forward. Murphy stumbled beside her, pale from blood loss. Mitchell kept him upright, jaw clenched. And then an explosion behind them lit the desert in fire, the facility unleashing its fury. Faster, Harrison urged. They'll be on us. By the time they reached the ridge, Ree's hands shook uncontrollably. She dropped to her knees, pulling the relay from her pack. Her fingers worked by instinct, assembling a makeshift tower from antennas and wires, grounding it in rocky soil. "Come on," she whispered, "come on." Static hissed, then clear as a bell, steadfast here, coordinates received, extraction in 20. A breath escaped her chest she hadn't realized she was holding. But as she turned, she saw headlights cresting the horizon, dozens too many. Harrison's gaze met hers, calm, firm. Hold them off until extraction. The team fanned out along the ridge, silhouettes against the stars, weapons raised, faces grim. Ree crouched low, rifle braced against her shoulder, hands trembling. She wasn't the best shot, she wasn't the strongest, but she was here, and here was enough. The first wave hit fast, vehicles screeching to a halt, enemies spilling into the desert with disciplined precision. Gunfire erupted, tracer rounds streaking through the night. Ree fired, each shot a jolt through her body. She missed more than she hit, but when one figure dropped, she felt both relief and horror. Mitchell cursed, reloading. Lopez dragged Murphy deeper into cover, hands slick with blood. And through it all, Ree's relay blinked. A green light, a promise, extraction was coming. But the minutes stretched like hours. The enemy pressed harder, closer, bullets shredding rocks around them. Ree's ears rang, her shoulder bruised from recoil, vision blurred with smoke and dust. Her heart screamed with one truth: they couldn't hold. Not this long, not against this many. Then overhead, the faint roar of rotors. She looked up, hope cutting through exhaustion. Shadows loomed against the stars, helicopters, U.S. Navy, extraction. Harrison's voice boomed over the chaos. "Hold the line, 30 more seconds." Ree squeezed the trigger again and again, body shaking, tears streaking her dust-stained face. And when the helicopters descended in a storm of wind and sand, when ropes dropped and voices shouted, when strong hands hauled Murphy aboard, Ree finally let herself breathe. She was the last pulled in, rifle clutched in trembling hands, the desert shrinking beneath her. As the helicopter lifted into the night, Ree collapsed against the cold metal floor, chest heaving, ears ringing. The patch in her pocket was soaked with sweat. She had survived, they had survived. But as the facility burned in the distance, and as her commander's eyes lingered on her with a weight she couldn't name, Ree realized something more terrifying than failure. This wasn't the end. This was the beginning. Why did silence feel louder than the gunfire had? That question gnawed at Ree Palmer as she sat strapped into the helicopter's metal bench, vibration rattling through her bones. The desert still burned behind them, orange flames clawing at the night sky. But inside the bird no one spoke, not a word. Murphy lay pale and bleeding, Lopez pressing gauze into his shoulder with quiet desperation. Mitchell stared into nothing, rifle limp in his hands. Even Harrison, usually a steady anchor, sat rigid, jaw clenched, eyes locked on some unseen horizon. Ree pressed her back against cold metal, helmet resting against the wall. Her hands still trembled from recoil, from adrenaline, from the unrelenting storm of survival. She stared at her palms, scratched, blistered, smeared with someone else's blood, and wondered how much of herself had been left in that desert. The helicopter landed on the Steadfast with a jolt that shook her teeth. Floodlights swept the deck as medics rushed forward, pulling Murphy onto a stretcher. Crew members shouted, boots thundered, equipment clattered. Ree unbuckled, her body moving on autopilot, but inside she was hollow. When she stepped onto the deck, The salt air hit her like a wave, but it carried no relief. She watched as Murphy disappeared below decks, swallowed by the chaos of triage. Then Harrison's voice cut through the din. "Palmer with me." She followed him into the steel corridors, boots echoing in tandem. The walk felt endless, the air growing colder, the fluorescent lights harsher. Finally, they entered a briefing room, empty except for a long table and a single folder placed neatly at the center. Harrison closed the door behind them. For a moment, neither spoke. Then he turned to her, eyes sharp. "You held that line." Her throat tightened, barely. Barely is the difference between living and dying out there. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You kept us connected. You gave us a way home. Without you, Palmer, we'd still be out there, or worse." The praise should have filled her with pride, but instead it sank like a stone. "Sir, they knew we were coming. They had our systems, our technology. That wasn't a coincidence. Someone gave it to them." Harrison's expression darkened. "I know." The silence that followed was suffocating. "Does command know?" she asked. His jaw worked. "They'll be briefed, but the official report will never say what we saw. That facility will be labeled a low-level depot. Intelligence error, nothing more." Her stomach turned, "But that's not the truth." "Truth," he said quietly, "is a luxury we don't always get in this work. What matters is survival, and the survival of those who never even know we were there." She wanted to argue, to scream, to demand why the system she served would bury the very threat that nearly killed them, but the weight in Harrison's eyes stopped her. He wasn't dismissing her. He was protecting her, protecting all of them. And suddenly she understood the cost of the patch she carried. It wasn't just sweat and blood. It was silence. When she returned to her quarters, she sat on the edge of her bunk, staring at the patch sewn into her uniform. The edges were frayed, the colors faded, but it held everything she couldn't say. Her reflection in the mirror looked foreign, eyes red, hair damp with sweat, skin gray with exhaustion. She didn't look like the woman who had joined the Navy, bright-eyed and determined. She looked older, harder. Alone. That night sleep didn't come. Memories replayed on a loop. Murphy collapsing under fire, Mitchell's pale face in the darkness, her own shaking hands on the rifle. And beneath it all, one question whispered louder than the rest. What if next time I fail? Days passed in a blur, debriefs, reports, endless questions from officers who already knew the answers they wanted. The facility was minimized, the enemy's capabilities downplayed, the betrayal ignored. Her words felt like they disappeared into a void. One evening, as the sun set across the steel horizon of the ocean, she stood alone on deck, wind tearing at her hair. She gripped the railing, eyes fixed on the fatting line where sea met sky. Harrison joined her silently, his presence grounding. For a while, neither spoke. Finally, he said, "You did well, better than most would have." Her jaw clenched. "It doesn't feel like enough." "It never will," he said. "That's the truth about this kind of work. You'll save 10 lives and only remember the one you couldn't. You'll walk away alive and wonder why it wasn't you left behind. The doubt doesn't leave. You just learn to carry it." His words settled deep, heavy but honest. "Why me?" she asked quietly. "Why did you trust me with the relay, with everything?" He looked at her then, his eyes steady. "Because you don't quit. You don't give up when it matters. That's rarer than skill, Palmer. That's why you're here." Her chest tightened. She wanted to believe him, needed to. But as night fell, she realized belief wasn't something handed to you. It was something you built, one choice at a time. Weeks later, back at the stateside facility, the team was scattered. Murphy underwent surgery. Mitchell was reassigned. Lopez took leave. The quiet in the barracks was suffocating. Ree carried her patch in silence, tucked where no one could see. To most, it was nothing, a scrap of cloth. To her, it was the weight of everything unsaid. During one inspection, Director Hayes, polished, smug, detached, paused in front of her uniform. His eyes narrowed on the patch. "Unauthorized," he sneered. "Remove it." Her chest clenched, the bay went silent, eyes shifted. And in that moment she was back in the desert, back in the shaft, back on the ridge. The patch wasn't unauthorized. It was earned, not for recognition, not for show, but because she had walked through fire and refused to break. Before she could answer, footsteps echoed. Commander Knox Mills stepped into the bay, presence commanding silence. His gaze swept the room, landed on her, then the patch. Recognition flickered in his eyes, not disdain, not doubt, respect. And when Hayes smirked, ready to strip her dignity with words, Mills spoke first. "That patch," he said evenly, "outranks anything you've got on your chest." The bay froze. Hayes' face reddened, his words caught in his throat. Ree's heart pounded, not with pride but with something quieter, something steadier. Validation. The kind she had never asked for, but desperately needed. The kind that told her, maybe, she wasn't alone in carrying the weight. Why did applause always feel emptier than silence? That thought lingered in Ree Palmer's mind as she stood in a hangar-turned-assembly hall weeks after the mission. Her unit had been recognized for exceptional service under hazardous conditions. A ceremony carefully crafted to say everything except the truth. Speeches echoed, medals gleamed, hands clapped politely, yet none of it touched the fire still smoldering inside her. She stood in formation, back straight, eyes forward, her patch tucked where only she knew. The officers praised bravery, discipline, sacrifice, but they didn't mention betrayal. They didn't mention advanced systems in enemy hands. They didn't mention how close they had come to dying. Her chest felt hollow. Later, in the quiet of her quarters, she stared at her reflection. The applause had faded, but the silence stayed. The mission replayed in her head, the suffocating crawl of the shaft, Murphy's blood on her hands, the green blink of the relay as the desert burned. It wasn't the gunfire that haunted her. It was the stillness afterward, the question that refused to leave. Why are we asked to carry truths no one wants to hear? Some nights she thought about telling someone, her mother, her brother, anyone who might understand, but what would she say? That the Navy sent her into a facility they swore was empty, that the enemy used American technology against them, that she fought ghosts and came back with scars no one could see. She couldn't, not because she didn't trust them, but because the silence was part of the oath. And so she carried it alone. But silence had weight, and weight demanded a place to rest. She found herself spending more hours in the maintenance bays, sleeves rolled up, grease staining her hands. Machines made sense. Circuits didn't lie. Wires didn't betray. If something broke, you fixed it. If something failed, you found the fault. People weren't like that. One night, hunched over a dismantled generator, she heard boots behind her. "You hide in here too much," Mitchell said. She glanced up. He looked different, thinner, sharper, shadows under his eyes. Survivors carried the same weight. "Better than pretending out there," she muttered. He leaned against the workbench. "They call it closure, debriefs, ceremonies, speeches, but we both know it's just theater, doesn't make the nightmare stop." Her hands stilled on the wrench. For the first time, she realized she wasn't the only one lying awake at night. "Do you ever think about leaving?" she asked quietly. He was silent for a long moment. Then, "Every day, and every day I stay, because I don't know who I'd be without it." His words struck deep. Who was she without the uniform? Without the missions, the silence, the patch no one recognized? Would she be Ree Palmer, daughter of a mechanic, sister to a man who never believed in her? Or would she be nothing at all? That night she dreamt of the desert again. But this time the dream shifted. She wasn't in the shaft. She wasn't at the relay. She was standing alone on the ridge, the helicopters gone, the team vanished, the enemy closing in. And she couldn't move. She woke with a gasp, sweat cold on her skin. The days blurred. Training cycles resumed. New sailors rotated in, wide-eyed and unscarred. Ree found herself watching them with a strange ache in her chest. She saw their determination, their hunger, their certainty that service meant answers. She wanted to warn them, to tell them answers never came, only questions that dug deeper the longer you served. But she stayed silent. Until one afternoon, during a systems test, she overheard Hayes, the same administrator who once mocked her, speaking with another officer. His voice carried easily across the bay. "Classified equipment transferred for evaluation," he said. "Experimental AI. Should have been locked stateside, but command insisted." Ree froze, the wrench slipping from her hand. Her heart thundered. Experimental AI, the same kind she had fought in that desert facility. Her stomach turned cold. It hadn't been a coincidence. It hadn't been betrayal from shadows. It had been sanctioned, deliberate. Someone had allowed technology to fall into enemy hands, and her team had bled for it. The realization shook her more than bullets ever had. That night she sat on her bunk, patch in her hands. The fabric felt heavier than ever, soaked with truths she couldn't speak. She wanted to tear it off, to throw it away, to stop carrying the burden of something so broken. But she couldn't, because it wasn't just a reminder of betrayal. It was proof of survival, of what she had endured, of what they had all endured. She pressed it to her chest, eyes stinging. The next morning, Commander Mills called her into his office. His presence was as steady as ever, his words deliberate. "I've read every report," he said. "The official story isn't the truth, but I've seen enough to know you're carrying more than anyone realizes." Her throat tightened. "Sir, with respect, it's not just me, Mitchell, Lopez, all of us." "I know," he leaned forward. "That's why you don't let Hayes or anyone else diminish that patch, because it's not just cloth. It's a reminder that you went where others wouldn't and came back when others couldn't. That matters, even if the reports bury it." She swallowed hard, words tangled in her chest. "Sir," she whispered, "what if I can't carry it forever?" His gaze softened. "Then you put it down when you're ready, but until then you stand tall, because sometimes dignity doesn't shout, it doesn't explain, it simply acts." The words lingered long after she left his office. And for the first time, she realized maybe her silence wasn't weakness. Maybe it was strength. But strength came with a cost. As the sun dipped below the horizon that evening, she stood on deck, the wind whipping at her uniform. She touched the patch over her chest, felt its rough edges, and made a quiet vow. She would carry it for herself, for Mitchell, for Murphy, for the truths buried under desert sand and sealed in classified reports. Not for recognition, not for applause, but because someone had to remember. And until the day she laid it down, she would. Why did the decision to leave feel heavier than the decision to stay? That question haunted Ree Palmer as she sat alone in the chow hall late at night, the room empty except for the hum of refrigerators and the faint buzz of overhead lights. A cold cup of coffee sat untouched in front of her. She stared at it as though the dark liquid might whisper answers. For months she had carried the silence, carried the patch, carried the truth of that desert mission in a world that pretended it had never happened. She had done her job, she had survived, and she had followed orders. But inside, something was shifting. Every day she woke with the same weight in her chest. Every night she closed her eyes and felt the crawl of the maintenance shaft, the thunder of gunfire on the ridge. She told herself it was normal that all soldiers carried ghosts, but hers weren't just ghosts. They were questions. What kind of service was this, where the truth had no place? What kind of loyalty was asked of her, when loyalty itself was repaid with silence? Mitchell had left 3 weeks earlier. Officially it was transfer to a stateside post, but Ree knew better. She had seen it in his eyes, the same exhaustion, the same doubts. He had reached his breaking point. Murphy remained in rehab, his recovery slow. Lopez was still around, quieter than ever, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Their team, once bound by survival, had scattered into fragments. Ree sat with her coffee and asked herself the question she had avoided for months. Why am I still here? The answer didn't come. Instead, the doors opened and Commander Mills entered. His presence filled the room even in silence. He crossed to her table without hesitation, pulling out a chair. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked. She shook her head. "Not lately." He studied her, the lines around his eyes deeper than before. "You're thinking about leaving." It wasn't a question. It was a truth, spoken aloud at last. Her throat tightened. "I don't know who I'd be without the uniform." "That's the trick of it," he said quietly. "The Navy teaches you discipline, resilience, purpose, but it doesn't teach you how to put those things back into the world when you take the uniform off. That part you learn on your own." She looked down at the patch on her chest, fingers brushing its frayed edges. "This is the only proof I have of what I've done, of what we all went through. Without it, I'm just another sailor who turns a wrench." Mills leaned forward, voice steady. "That patch is proof to you, Palmer. It doesn't need to be proof to anyone else. You know what it means, I know what it means, and that's enough." Tears stung her eyes, but she blinked them back. "Sometimes I wonder if it was worth it, if the silence is worth carrying." His gaze didn't waver. "The silence isn't for the system. It's for the people who'll never know what you did. The families who'll never hear their loved ones almost didn't come home. The children who'll grow up safe because of missions they'll never read about. That's who you carry it for." Her chest ached with the weight of his words. That night she lay awake in her bunk, staring at the ceiling, and thought of the choice before her. Stay, leave, carry the silence, or put it down. The weeks that followed blurred into routine. Training, maintenance, drills. Every day she went through the motions, but beneath the surface she was already halfway gone. Until the day the call came. Another mission, another briefing. This time she wasn't chosen. She sat on the sidelines, watching new names, new faces, fresh eyes filled with determination. She felt like a ghost haunting a room that no longer needed her. When the team departed, she walked the empty hallways of the facility, the silence heavier than ever. She passed the maintenance bay where Hayes once mocked her, the briefing room where Harrison had handed her the relay, the corridor where Mills had spoken words that steadied her when she was breaking. And she realized something she hadn't before. It wasn't the missions that defined her. It wasn't the patch. It wasn't even the silence. It was the choice. Every day she had chosen to stay, chosen to fight, chosen to carry the weight when it would have been easier to set it down. And now she had to choose again. That evening she stood on deck as the sun sank into the horizon. The sea glowed gold, the air heavy with salt. She held the patch in her hands, tracing its edges, remembering every face tied to it: Murphy, Mitchell, Lopez, Harrison. Remembering her own reflection in the glass before she first crossed into the classified facility. She whispered into the wind, a vow meant for no one but herself. "I'll carry it as long as I can, and when I can't, I'll let it rest." For the first time in months, the weight eased. Because the choice wasn't about staying or leaving. It was about dignity, and dignity wasn't in the uniform. It was in the act of refusing to break, whether she wore it or not. She pressed the patch back onto her chest, straightened her shoulders, and turned toward the glow of the horizon. The decision wasn't final yet, but for the first time she was at peace with not knowing. Sometimes strength wasn't certainty. Sometimes strength was simply enduring the question. And Ree Palmer, sailor survivor, silent bearer of truths, would endure. Why did endings never feel like endings? That question pressed against Ree Palmer's chest as she stood in her dress uniform one final time, the weight of the patch over her heart heavier than any metal they had ever pinned on her. The bass hummed with its usual rhythm, engines roaring in distant hangars, boots striking pavement, voices rising and fading with routine. To everyone else, it was just another day. To her, It was the last. The papers were signed, her service complete. She had chosen to leave. It wasn't easy. The choice had gnawed at her for months. Every corridor she walked carried echoes. Every inspection bay reminded her of silence, of humiliation turned to validation. Every training ground carried the ghosts of those who hadn't come back. To stay meant carrying the silence forever. To leave meant carrying it alone. And yet she had chosen. She walked the base slowly, memorizing it like a photograph. The clang of steel doors, the sharp scent of oil and salt, the sight of young sailors running drills, unaware of how the years would change them. She wondered if one day they too would stand where she stood, haunted, proud, uncertain. At the end of the pier she paused. The ocean stretched wide and endless, reflecting sunlight in fractured shards. She closed her eyes and heard it again, the whine of helicopter rotors, the thunder of gunfire, the voice of Harrison telling her to hold the line. She smelled the sand, the dust, the fire. She felt the patch against her skin, soaked with sweat and silence. Her chest tightened, but she didn't turn away. "Palmer." The voice pulled her back. Commander Mills approached, hands clasped behind his back, expression as steady as ever. "You're really leaving," he said. She nodded, "Yes, sir." A pause, then softer, "You've earned that choice." Her throat tightened. Does it ever get easier, the silence? He looked out at the sea, his jaw hard. "No, you just learn to live alongside it. Some people bury it, some let it eat them alive, and a few," he glanced at her, "they carry it with dignity, quietly, without needing anyone to understand." She swallowed hard. "I don't know which one I'll be." He studied her, then gave the smallest nod. "You'll be the one you choose." They stood in silence, the wind tugging at their uniforms. Finally, Mills extended his hand. "Whatever you do, wherever you go, remember this. That patch doesn't lose meaning just because you leave the Navy. It's not the uniform that gives it weight. It's you." Her hand shook as she gripped his, strong, steady. "Thank you, sir," she whispered. When he walked away, she remained at the pier, staring at the horizon until the sun sank low. Later, in her small apartment far from base, she opened the drawer where she kept her patch. She had thought about putting it away for good, locking it with other keepsakes. But instead, she set it gently on her nightstand. It was frayed, it was faded, it was silent. But it was hers. The years that followed weren't easy. Civilian life didn't know what to make of her. Job interviews focused on certifications, not classified missions. Neighbors saw only a quiet woman with steady eyes. No one asked about deserts or helicopters or code battles fought in shadows. And she didn't tell them. But some nights when the weight grew too much, she would take the patch in her hands and remember. Not just the fear, not just the fire, but the faces: Mitchell, Murphy, Lopez, Harrison, Mills, the ones who had carried the silence with her. In those moments, she realized something she hadn't before. The patch wasn't about proving worth. It wasn't about recognition. It wasn't even about survival. It was about dignity, the kind that doesn't need an audience, the kind that endures without applause, the kind that outlives uniforms and ranks and titles. Years later, she returned to the coast. She stood at the edge of the water, the waves crashing at her feet, the horizon stretching endless. She pressed the patch against her chest one last time, then let the wind lift it from her hands. It fluttered, caught in the air, then drifted down into the sea. She didn't cry, she didn't smile. She simply stood tall, watching it disappear into the water, the silence within her at last finding a place to rest. And in that moment she understood. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It doesn't explain. It doesn't defend itself. It simply acts.